When President Eisenhower made that speech in 1961, there were very few think tanks. There were a few, but not very many. And what they did was they sort of turned out policy papers, but they were not big players in the foreign policy game. Today, there are more than 1,800 think tanks in the US, and 400 of them in and around Washington. And they don't think, they justify, according to one of the critics, a guy by the name of Jonathan Alter. Now, very recently, just within the last few weeks, the New York Times did a huge spread on the way in which these think tanks operate. Because ideally you would think, oh, it's a think tank, it's independent, it's giving us a nonpartisan point of view and research and conclusions. But what the New York Times reported and what the book shows is the think tanks actually are often pushing the agenda of the people who fund them and their studies. And they specifically, in the New York Times piece, had a couple of defense contractors as examples of how this happened. Now, Elizabeth Warren was outraged by this. You may remember there were stories about her reaction to this, Senator Elizabeth Warren, because in her view, what they're doing by sort of laundering their position through the think tank is that it's a very thinly disguised form of lobbying and dangerous. There's a good YouTube piece with her talking about this. Now, with the exception of the libertarians at the Cato Institute, who typically oppose any kind of intervention, the conservative think tanks are very aggressive on interventions and on the way in which America uses its military to manage the world. The group that provided the rationale for the invasion of Iraq was called the Project for the New American Century, PNAC. It was a small arm of the American Enterprise Institute, which is the largest and one of the best-known conservative think tanks. Now, the Iraq invasion was in 2003. But as early as 1998, the people at PNAC were writing letters. One of them went to President Clinton calling for the removal of Saddam Hussein. Who signed that letter in 1998 saying, let's get rid of Saddam Hussein? Donald Rumsfeld, Paul Wolfowitz, Richard Pearl, and others who favored a new Pax America to extend American influence around the world. Now, President Clinton, as you obviously figured out, ignored the letter. But on September 20th, 2001, this is 9 days after the 9/11 attacks, PNAC writes to President Bush, who is now in the White House, repeating its call for regime change in Iraq. And this time, the people who'd signed that 1998 letter were actually in the government.